That morning, they fired me without warning. Just handed me a box and walked me out the front door. My name is Michael Grant. I'm 48, a systems security engineer living in Glendale, Arizona. Married 20 years. One daughter in college. I don't drink, don't gamble, pay every bill on time. Until this morning, I thought I understood how the world worked. It had started weeks before. Not with anything dramatic, no slammed doors, no cold shoulders. Just small shifts. Rachel was quieter, but not distant. Kind, but detached. She still kissed me goodnight, still asked about my day. But her eyes had started flicking away before I finished speaking. The first change was her schedule. She used to work out of the home office most mornings, then head out for showings in the afternoons. Now she left early, said she had coffee with clients, urgent meetings, new listings. I didn't question it. In real estate, rhythms change. But hers were changing too fast. She started coming home late, always with explanations ready. Traffic. A tough seller. Last-minute walkthroughs. Her tone was too precise, like she'd practiced the lines on the drive home. And she'd stopped asking me how my day was, which was unlike her. Then there was the phone. She used to leave it on the table, in her purse, even on the bathroom sink. Now it was always face down, always within reach. She'd pick it up casually, glance, lock the screen, and slide it away without a word. It wasn't the action itself, it was how smooth she'd become at hiding it. I didn't ask. I didn't accuse. I just watched. Some evenings, she came home wearing a new scent, not perfume exactly, more like a mix of laundry and something unfamiliar. Once or twice, I noticed faint glitter near her collarbone. Rachel never wore makeup like that. Not for me, anyway. She began working on weekends again. Said she had a client looking for a house in the foothills, which meant longer drives. But when I asked about the deal's progress, she gave vague answers. Said the buyer was indecisive, that it was complicated. I remembered that last Saturday before the firing. She left early, said she might be gone all day. I offered to make her breakfast, but she said she didn't have time. Her keys were already in her hand. She kissed me on the cheek, said, "Wish me luck," and walked out the door. I stood in the living room for a while after she left. The morning sun was sharp through the windows. I tried to work, but couldn't focus. Something was off. I could feel it. Not just in her behavior, but in the house itself. There was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Like I was waiting for something I couldn't name. That afternoon, I passed by our closet and noticed that her travel bag was gone. It wasn't a big one, just a small overnight type, but she hadn't mentioned any plans to stay out. When I asked her about it that night, she said she'd taken it to carry brochures and water bottles for her clients. She smiled as she said it, natural, effortless. But she never brought it back upstairs. And I never saw those brochures. I told myself I was overthinking. That after 2 decades of routine, people change. Schedules shift. Maybe we were just aging into new roles. But then came Monday. The call to the conference room. The strangers in suits. The folder with my name printed neatly on the tab. No explanations. No apologies. They use phrases like restructuring and financial outlook, but none of it mattered. I saw it in their eyes. The decision had been made before I walked through the door. I left the building with a box under my arm and 18 years behind me. On the drive home, I didn't think about the job. I thought about the bag. The perfume. The phone turned face down on the table. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same. But nothing felt right anymore. And what happened next, what came after that quiet morning, was something I never imagined, not even in my darkest, most distrustful thoughts. The morning after they let me go, I followed my routine with mechanical precision. I woke early, showered, dressed in the same gray shirt and slacks I'd worn to the office the week before. I made coffee, packed the same modest lunch, nodded to Rachel as she prepared to leave, and waited until her car disappeared around the corner. Then I sat in the kitchen and did nothing. It's strange how quickly structure collapses when there's no one left to observe it. Without a purpose, time flattens. Hours become indistinguishable. But even within that stillness, something inside me stayed sharply alert. Rachel had said she was showing a property near Mesa that day. She'd left dressed for it, businesslike, clean lines, just enough makeup. Her hair pinned back in that deliberate way she did when she expected to be seen. I sat for another hour before walking quietly into her home office. Not to snoop, at least that's what I told myself. Just to notice. The space was too neat. No stray papers, no clutter, no coffee mugs left half full the way she used to when she was actually busy. Her laptop was shut down, the monitor dark. On the corner of her desk sat a slim black planner, leather-bound, the kind she liked. I flipped it open. The pages were mostly blank. Sparse appointments, vague descriptions. One caught my eye, a 2-hour block labeled simply Review Prep. No location, no contact, no notes. Dated a week prior, around the time she told me she was helping a first-time buyer. I closed the book and moved on. In the living room, her phone charger was plugged in but unused. I hadn't seen her charge her phone out here in weeks. It was always with her now, even in the bathroom. That kind of vigilance doesn't come from habit. It comes from fear of discovery. Later that day, I logged into our mobile account. We were still under a shared plan, though Rachel handled most of the billing. I pulled up the usage details, line by line. One number stood out immediately, over 60 messages exchanged in the last 4 days. Morning. Late afternoon. After midnight. Short bursts. Gaps. Then another burst. No name. I ran the number through an online directory. Scottsdale. No business listing. Just a personal line. She'd mentioned no new clients in that area. I noted the number and moved on. That evening, I opened the drawer of my nightstand and found something small and out of place, a business card tucked behind a book I hadn't touched in months. It was from a private legal services firm, a name I didn't recognize. On the back, written in my wife's handwriting, were 2 words. Safe copy. I stared at it longer than I needed to. The card looked old, but not forgotten. It had been placed, not dropped. And the message wasn't random. It felt like a breadcrumb. Not meant for me, perhaps, but left close enough that I would find it if I ever started looking. Something deeper was happening. Something deliberate. The next morning, I watched from the kitchen window as she left the house again. She smiled when she saw me, waved lightly, pulled away with practiced grace. Once her car was gone, I stepped into the garage and checked the shelves above the old tool cabinet. We kept old files there, tax records, receipts, and once, a fireproof box for insurance documents. I hadn't opened it in years. It wasn't locked. Inside, everything looked untouched, except for a small manila folder that hadn't been there the last time I looked. On the tab, Estate. I opened it carefully. Inside were copies of our mortgage, title, and an unfamiliar document, drafted 6 months ago, naming her as sole executor of our joint assets in the event of my incapacity. The language was dry, but intentional. It made no mention of me initiating the document. I read it twice. Then I checked the revision history online. It had been drafted the same week I returned from a 3-day work trip. A week when she'd insisted I rest while she caught up on paperwork. That was the moment something shifted. It wasn't jealousy or even betrayal I felt, it was strategic movement. Her steps weren't emotional. They were legal. Administrative. Quiet. She wasn't just seeing someone. She was building something. Or preparing to dismantle something else. I closed the folder and returned everything exactly as I'd found it. That night, I acted as I always did. I made tea. We watched the news in silence. She made a brief comment about the rising interest rates, then left to take a quick call in the bedroom. I stayed on the couch, eyes fixed on the television but mind nowhere near it. It was no longer a question of whether something was happening. The question now was, How long had she been planning it? And whether I was already too late? The days passed like slow turns of a key, each one unlocking a little more of the truth. I said nothing to Rachel. I prepared her coffee in the morning, nodded at her plans, and responded with the same level of mild interest I always had. I wore silence like armor. But inside I was charting a map of her movements, her stories, her inconsistencies. The GPS tracker I'd planted on her car was a passive device. It logged routes every few seconds, stored them silently, left no signal. Shadow following a shadow. Every 2 days I retrieved it, downloaded the logs, and studied them in the garage like an engineer analyzing failure points. She rarely went where she claimed. When she said she had a showing in Chandler, she spent 40 minutes parked near a small gated community in Scottsdale. When she claimed to be running errands downtown, the tracker showed her parked for 2 hours behind a medical complex that offered no parking for the public. She never brought home brochures, never talked about clients by name anymore. I never asked. Instead, I matched locations against her call records, her planner, her fuel receipts. Her explanations weren't just thin, they were inconsistent across time. She couldn't even lie with continuity. But what concerned me more was that she didn't seem to care whether the lies held up at all. As if she believed I'd never check. As if I wasn't watching. I created a digital file system, dates, call logs, locations, times, screenshots of statements. I cross-referenced each instance she claimed to be in one place against her actual position. By the end of that week, I had 32 separate discrepancies. Still, I had no name. No face. Just movements and numbers. That changed on a Wednesday. She left for a networking event. Said she might be home late. I waited 15 minutes, then followed. Not directly, 3 streets behind, switching lanes, taking side routes. I saw her car turn into a parking garage near a small event venue, but instead of entering, she circled once and exited on the other side. I followed. She drove 6 miles north and parked at a residential building I didn't recognize. A man came out to meet her. He held a bag, something light, maybe takeout. They didn't embrace. But they walked in together. She didn't come out for over an hour. I didn't need to guess anymore. But what I wasn't prepared for was the detail that surfaced 2 days later, one that didn't fit the pattern of a simple affair. I was reviewing an old laptop I hadn't touched in months. It had long been replaced, but I remembered it had once synced to our cloud archive. I turned it on, connected it, and searched through an old backup folder. Most of it was standard: vacation photos, grocery lists, joint budget plans. Then I found a document titled simply, Transfer Options. It was password protected. Rachel's password. I tried an old one, the name of her first dog. It opened. Inside were scanned images, documents about property division, powers of attorney, early drafts of a revised will. But the dates weren't recent. They were from 2 years ago. Long before the lies had started. Each file had been reviewed by someone. There were digital signatures from a paralegal I didn't know. Notarized pages. Consulted, dated, filed. It wasn't just betrayal. She had been preparing a departure long before the distance between us even began to show. It changed the entire timeline. It meant that while I believed we were steady, paying the mortgage, discussing college plans, she had already begun constructing the legal framework to leave cleanly. I closed the folder and stared at the screen. This wasn't about desire. It was about design. That night, something even stranger happened. I received an anonymous envelope in our mailbox. No return address. Handwritten. Inside, just one printed photo. Rachel. In the same cafe she once claimed she'd stopped visiting. Sitting across from a man I didn't recognize. They weren't touching. But they were close. Too close. Her face leaned toward his, smiling with a softness I hadn't seen in years. On the back, in neat block letters, was a single sentence. You aren't the only one watching. No explanation. No sender. No context. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at that line until the sun went down. There were more layers than I'd imagined. I wasn't just uncovering her story, I had stepped into someone else's. Whether it was a warning or a threat, I didn't know. But someone else knew what she was doing. And they wanted me to know, too. That was when I realized this wasn't only about her. It was about what she might have told someone else. What she might be hiding from them, not just from me. And what they expected me to do next. I kept the photo in my desk drawer, hidden under a folder of tax returns. I hadn't shown it to anyone. Hadn't asked Rachel about it. The message on the back echoed in my mind with quiet menace. You aren't the only one watching. I didn't know if it was a threat, an invitation, or something more manipulative. What I did know was this: I had entered territory where no assumptions were safe. Until then, everything had been theory, suspicion, behavior. The photo changed that. It was evidence, yes, but not just of her betrayal. It revealed the triangle. Someone else had eyes on her. Someone else was pulling a string, leaving me a breadcrumb, expecting, what? Gratitude? Fear? An alliance? I didn't react. I adapted. I spent the next 3 days combing through every traceable system I had access to: credit card logs, cloud backups, saved chats, document histories. Nothing from Rachel's laptop. It had been wiped weeks earlier. She claimed it had slowed down, said she'd taken it to a tech guy she knew. I hadn't thought twice then. Now I realized that machine might have contained the entire timeline of her plan. And it was gone. But cloud records are harder to erase. I searched for accounts she didn't think I knew still existed. An old Gmail from before we were married, still linked to a shared vacation app we had used once. The account had last been accessed 3 weeks ago from an IP address in a different state. Colorado. She hadn't been to Colorado. At least, not with me. The inbox was mostly empty. But the trash folder hadn't been fully purged. Among old flight confirmations and spam, I found a forwarded message that had been partially encrypted. The title was vague. Offer revised per attached terms. The file had no content, only metadata showing it had been opened twice, both times on a Thursday afternoon. The day she told me she'd been home all day with a headache. The file name was clearer. Preview_final.pdf. I didn't need to open it to understand. She wasn't planning an exit. She was finalizing one. The name on the original sender matched a law firm in Denver that specialized in discrete separation agreements, private arbitration, and offshore account protections. Her signature wasn't on the attachment, but it didn't need to be. The timeline was now undeniable. This hadn't started with infidelity. It had started with erasure. She was scrubbing me out of her world. Legally, financially, structurally. And I had no idea how far along she was. I checked the family trust account. Still intact. No withdrawals. But when I tried to log into our joint safe deposit access, the system rejected me. My name had been removed. Not formally. Technically, the account still listed us both. But the bank system flagged my login as unauthorized. I drove to the branch the next day. They told me the key had been changed. I didn't show anger. I thanked them and walked out slowly, like a man who'd simply forgotten something. That night, I sat in my car a few blocks away from the house, watching the windows. 2 silhouettes moved inside. Hers and another. A man. Not the one from the photo. Taller. He left through the side gate 15 minutes later. She didn't see me. I didn't need to know his name. What mattered was the pattern. What mattered was the certainty. But the final piece, the one that burned everything else into clarity, came from a hard drive I'd forgotten existed. It was buried in the back of my office closet, wrapped in an old sweatshirt. Years ago, Rachel had used it to back up family photos. At some point, I'd repurposed it for work projects and archived system images. It hadn't been plugged in since we moved into the new house. I powered it up on a whim. What I found was a backup folder, labeled innocently _calendar_sync, inside of which were CSV files. Calendar exports. They dated back 3 years. I opened the most recent one and started scanning the data. Her entries were sparse. But 2 words kept appearing, once a week, across nearly 6 months. Client follow-up. Always the same time. Always 2 hours long. No location. But one of the older entries had a location field left on by mistake. The address was a mailbox rental facility in Tempe. I checked their website. They rented private boxes with forwarding services. I drove out the next morning. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was necessity. The storefront was modest, tucked between a dry cleaner and a locksmith. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. I waited in my car for 2 hours. She didn't show. But someone else did. A man in a business coat. Average build. Looked like anyone. He stepped in, came out a few minutes later with 2 envelopes, and walked briskly toward a waiting car with tinted windows. He wasn't alone. Someone else was inside that car. And I recognized the silhouette in the passenger seat. It wasn't Rachel. But it was someone I'd worked with years ago. Briefly. Quietly. A man tied to compliance audits during an internal investigation I had supported at my old firm. His presence made no sense. Until I remembered something. The company that fired me didn't downsize anyone else. Just me. And Rachel had once done business with their executive partner. That's when the shape of it all finally came into focus. Her betrayal wasn't just personal. It was professional. And it had started long before I ever felt the distance in her voice. By the time I understood the scope of what she was doing, the damage had already begun. Not in the legal sense, nothing irreversible had been filed. But the intent was clear. Rachel hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. She had constructed an exit route with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it long before I ever felt her slipping away. The difference between instinct and strategy is simple. Instinct reacts. Strategy prepares. I prepared. It began with the accounts. She hadn't moved large sums, nothing that would draw attention. But the patterns were there, small transfers between checking and brokerage accounts, a new credit card under her maiden name, deposits funneled through a firm I recognized from a past client's shell setup. I compiled it all, dates, values, institutions. I didn't confront her. I archived it. Next came the house. The mortgage was joint. The insurance policy wasn't. Quietly, 6 months earlier, she'd changed the primary beneficiary to a trust. No explanation, no mention. I contacted the insurance firm and requested policy clarification as the co-owner of the property. They stalled, citing administrative protocols. That told me everything I needed to know. I filed a legal title freeze. A common process, easily triggered by suspected fraud. It required notarized signatures from both parties for any changes moving forward. It was a formality. But also a wall. She wouldn't see it until she tried to act. Then I turned inward. I ordered my credit report from every major bureau. I placed a lock on all open lines. If she tried to open anything in my name, even by mistake, it would be flagged. I checked digital keys on our joint devices. The home Wi-Fi had been accessed remotely the week I was terminated. The IP address matched a server out of Denver. Not one of our devices. She wasn't working alone. That was the final piece I needed to act. I initiated quiet separation steps. I hired a lawyer, not for divorce, yet, but for asset protection. I moved a portion of my severance into a new account under a trust one named after my father. I filed no public paperwork, made no social media changes, left no trace in our shared circles. I made copies of documents she thought she'd hidden, versions of tax returns, property receipts, letters she'd discarded but not destroyed. I wasn't angry. I was awake. From there, the moves became bolder. I created a narrative, not to tell others, but to prepare my side of the field. In this kind of war, truth isn't what you say, it's what others already suspect when they hear it. I collected neutral evidence, conversations, financial statements, subtle omissions in her daily routine. I built timelines that overlapped hers. I showed gaps, contradictions, trends. I wasn't trying to ruin her. I was preparing to make it impossible for her to ruin me. And still, every morning, I made her coffee. I kissed her cheek. I nodded when she said she'd be out late. She believed, fully, that I was still in the dark. But small things were changing. She began to hesitate when explaining her day. She started checking her phone more often when I was in the room, then less often, as if afraid to draw attention. She offered to do the taxes herself this year. Volunteered even. I let her. It was a test she didn't know she was taking. The file she submitted omitted the transfer I had flagged weeks before. A quiet attempt to erase the trail. That was when I knew it was time to prepare the endgame. I scheduled a private meeting with our estate planner. I adjusted my will, restructuring ownership of assets she thought she still controlled. I designated conditional trustees. I secured everything she had left exposed, then locked it all behind biometric access. She could still live in the illusion that she held the reins. But behind every shared password, every account, every plan, my fingerprint was now the only one that mattered. She moved through the house as she always had, but the space had shifted. The silence between us began to grow a texture, almost like insulation. Not cold. Not angry. Just impermeable. She could feel it. The temperature had changed. The rhythm no longer belonged to her. And what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that by the time she reached for the exit, I had already locked every door behind her. She didn't notice the difference at first. That was the point. When you've built your deception slowly, you assume everyone else is moving at your pace. You grow confident in your own narrative. You believe the person across from you still clings to hope, or doubt, or at least confusion. You believe they still want to believe you. I no longer did. The confrontation wasn't an explosion. It was an arrangement, carefully timed, like the final turn of a combination lock. Click by click, truth aligning with truth, until the door simply opened. It happened on a Sunday. We'd been invited to a casual dinner by mutual acquaintances, an older couple we both knew through her real estate work. Rachel had hesitated, but agreed. She always accepted invitations where she could control the narrative. She dressed deliberately, chose her words carefully, laughed too loudly at familiar stories. She performed stability. So did I. We arrived together. Smiled together. Sat beside each other at the table. What she didn't expect was the seating arrangement. Directly across from her, seated beside our host, was a man she didn't know I knew. The compliance officer from my former company. He greeted me with a firm nod and a look that told me everything. He'd received the files I'd sent. He'd opened them. He understood. Rachel froze for less than a second. Then recovered. Laughed again. Said something light. But her hand, which had been resting on the table, disappeared into her lap. She no longer had control of the tempo. The conversation flowed. About markets. About travel. About future plans. And then, with casual precision, the host mentioned an audit. Something about an internal review. Routine, of course. Just standard housekeeping. But apparently it had led to questions about access, about document handling, about third-party communications. Rachel's glass paused halfway to her lips. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. The next day, I told her I was meeting with an attorney. No accusation. No explanation. Just a neutral fact. She asked what it was about. I told her I needed to secure my records. For future clarity. That was all. She didn't speak for a long time. 2 nights later, she tried to log into one of the accounts I had frozen. The system flagged the attempt. She failed the secondary authentication. Tried again. Failed. 20 minutes later, she came downstairs. Said nothing. The next morning, I left early. Returned with a single envelope. Inside were copies of property locks, asset protections, document trails she had attempted to erase. I placed it on the kitchen counter. Said nothing. walked upstairs. She didn't follow. When I returned, the envelope was gone. But the house had changed. She moved through it like a guest now. Polite. Careful. Distant. That night, I heard her crying through the door of the guest room. I didn't react. The power dynamic had reversed, but I wasn't chasing retribution. I was demonstrating precision. She tried twice in the following days to initiate conversation about us. Once over breakfast. Once in the car. Both times I answered with logistical clarity, finances, property, timelines. I offered no warmth. No cruelty. Just the cool finality of a man who had already completed his decision in silence. The final fracture came when she attempted to move a small sum from a dormant joint account, one she thought I'd forgotten. She found it empty. Reallocated. Legally. Months ago. The document confirming the transfer had been sent to her email 30 seconds before she logged in. She never mentioned it. But from that day forward, she stopped pretending. Stopped smiling. Stopped checking her phone as often. Stopped offering stories about her day. We still lived in the same house. But only one of us still lived in the same story. And then, 3 days later, a new envelope arrived. No return address. No handwriting. Inside was a single printed photo. Not of her. Of me. Taken through the window of my office at night. No note. No message. Just the image. For a long moment, I stared at it in silence. And I realized that whatever game Rachel had started, I was now playing it on a field neither of us controlled anymore. For weeks, the house had grown quieter, but not in the way silence comforts. It had weight now. The absence of noise between us was dense, suffocating, deliberate, final. Rachel moved through it like someone awaiting a verdict, unsure when it would fall, but knowing deep down that the sentence had already been decided. She still believed I was reacting. She had no idea I had already moved on. The truth is, I hadn't learned about the affair in the way most men do. It didn't arrive like a dagger to the chest. It didn't explode through a phone screen or in a whispered confession. I had known for much longer than I ever let on. Long before the phone turned face down. Long before the late-night calls and silent drives. Before the secret meetings and buried accounts. I knew from the moment I was fired. The official reason, of course, was cost-cutting. Restructuring. But the timing had never made sense. The department didn't shrink. My workload didn't vanish. My credentials hadn't changed. What changed, what triggered everything, was a quiet whisper from someone I once trusted. A breach. A compliance flag. An anonymous report questioning my access to sensitive internal files. And Rachel, conveniently, had been spending more time networking. Only later did I learn that the man she'd been meeting, the one I thought was just a passing distraction, was more than a lover. He was a data liaison with access to our internal audit systems. He wasn't just in her life, he was inside mine. Feeding her exactly what she needed to remove me from both our company and our marriage with surgical efficiency. But they made one mistake. They trusted each other too much. The envelope with the photo hadn't been a threat. It had been a message, from someone watching both of them. A man who had once worked beside me. Quiet, methodical, unimportant in appearance. I hadn't seen him since a compliance audit 3 years ago. At the time, he'd flagged an irregularity Rachel had somehow managed to bury. I never knew the details. Now I did. He had been following the pattern long before I noticed the symptoms. Rachel's manipulation wasn't new to him. She had used someone like him before, then burned him to cover her trail. Left him unemployed. Discredited. Forgotten. He hadn't forgotten her. The photo was his way of reaching me. Not to warn. To offer a hand. Over the next few weeks, he sent more. Not just images. Documents. Financial inconsistencies tied to shell accounts. A flagged insurance transfer that hadn't been legal. A memo draft she had ghostwritten and submitted under another name. It all pointed to a broader scheme, one that crossed professional lines, with potential legal consequences far beyond infidelity. I archived every page. I never showed her. By then, she was already unraveling. Her new accounts were failing. The people she had trusted were backing away. The man she had once whispered to behind my back? His name had been added to an internal investigation. I didn't file it. But someone else had. That was the final irony. She'd spent months dismantling me. And in doing so, she had exposed herself to people far less forgiving. I gave her no grand farewell. No final confrontation. I didn't announce my exit or give her a moment to scream or cry. I simply left. Quietly. Early morning. Before sunrise. The moving truck had come 2 days earlier, loaded not with furniture, but documents, servers, hard drives, sealed boxes of memory and evidence. My name on the mailbox disappeared that afternoon. She called twice. I didn't answer. She emailed once. Just a single line. "Where are you?" I didn't reply. Because by then, I wasn't waiting for her to understand. I had accepted that she never would. I relocated to another state. Took a position with a firm that valued quiet competence over corporate theater. I rented a house with fewer windows and more locks. I planted a tree in the yard. Not as a symbol. Just because it was something solid. Something I could choose. Sometimes, late at night, I still think of her. Not with love. With precision. The way a surgeon recalls a scar. Not for the pain. For the lesson. She's still out there, likely trying to piece together a story that makes her look like a victim. Telling friends half-truths. Rewriting her timeline. Wondering how everything slipped away so fast. But it didn't. It slipped away slowly. Quietly. By the time she realized what was gone, I was already gone too. And everything she thought was hers was already mine. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, about real men who don't shout. They act. Coldly? To the end?